Picture the heat of a Roman afternoon, the sun beating down on the marble of the Forum. The air is thick with anticipation, buzzing with the voices of hundreds, maybe thousands of citizens, all gathered for one purpose, to cast their vote. Senators in crisp white togas mingle with merchants, soldiers, and ordinary Romans, all aware that the decisions made today could change the course of the empire. It's a scene of incredible energy, of raw political power playing out in public, and at first glance, it might feel strangely familiar, even modern. But here's where things get truly fascinating. This is ancient Rome, 2,000 years ago, a civilization that helped shape the very idea of democracy, yet whose voting methods remain shrouded in mystery. How did they do it? Was it a fair system, or one easily manipulated by the powerful? And perhaps most intriguing of all, what secrets about power, trust, and human nature are hidden in the way they voted? We often think of ancient Rome in grand terms: gladiators, emperors, legions marching across continents, but some of its most lasting influences are quieter, woven into the fabric of how we govern ourselves today. The idea that citizens have a voice, that their votes matter, that leadership should, in some way, be accountable to the people. These concepts were being tested, refined, and sometimes twisted, right here in the heart of the Roman Republic. And yet, for a society so advanced, so meticulously organized, the act of voting itself was unlike anything we would recognize now. There were no paper ballots, no voting machines, no mass media campaigns. Instead, there was something more tactile, more theatrical, and in many ways, more mysterious. That mystery is what we're setting out to unravel together. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a detective story. We're going to walk through the crowds, stand where Roman citizens stood, and piece together how one of the most influential civilizations in history made collective decisions. We'll explore the physical objects they used, the rules they followed, and the clever, and sometimes shockingly flawed methods they designed to keep power in check or to concentrate it. And along the way, we might just find that the questions they faced about fairness, transparency, and the integrity of the vote are questions we're still grappling with today. So come with me, let's step back into the Forum and uncover the hidden world of ancient Roman voting. So who actually had a voice in this bustling scene? To cast a vote in ancient Rome, you first had to be a citizen, a status far more exclusive than we might assume. The right was reserved for free-born adult males. This immediately excluded the vast majority of the population, all women, all enslaved people, and anyone born outside the realm of Roman citizenship. Even among the men who qualified, your influence wasn't equal. Your wealth, your social standing, and even your family name carried immense weight long before you ever reached the voting area. This privileged group exercised its power in formal gatherings known as the Comitia, or assemblies. Think of these not as a single event, but as the fundamental institutions of republican government. The two most important were the Comitia Centuriata and the Comitia Tributa. Each had a distinct purpose and, crucially, a very different way of organizing voters that dramatically affected the outcome of every decision. The Comitia Centuriata was the assembly for weighty matters of state. This was the body that declared war or ratified treaties and elected the most powerful magistrates, like the consuls and praetors. But its organization was anything but equal. It divided citizens into groups called centuries based on wealth and military service. The richest citizens, those who could afford the best armor and horses, were placed in the first few centuries. And here's the catch: each century, regardless of how many people were in it, cast just one single vote. The wealthiest centuries voted first, and if they all agreed, the matter was often decided before the poorer. Much more populous centuries even got a chance to have their say. It was a system designed to give the elite a commanding, and often decisive, advantage. The Comitia Tributa, or tribal assembly, was somewhat more democratic in its structure. It grouped citizens based on their geographical tribe essentially, where their family originated or where they lived. It handled the election of lesser officials and voted on many laws. While this system gave more voice to the common people, the plebeians, it wasn't without its own imbalances. The number of urban tribes, for instance, was limited, meaning the votes of the massive population in the city of Rome itself were often concentrated and could be outweighed by the collective votes of the rural tribes. So from the very beginning, the architecture of Roman voting was built not on the principle of one person, one vote, but on a complex framework that carefully calibrated and often curtailed the political power of the masses. Now let's pull back the curtain on the main event, the Comitia Centuriata. This was the big league of Roman politics, the assembly responsible for the highest stakes decisions a republic could face. It elected the consuls, the two most powerful magistrates in Rome, who held ultimate executive and military command. It chose the praetors, the chief legal authorities. Most significantly, this was the body that had the solemn power to declare war and ratify peace treaties. A vote here could literally change the map and seal the fate of thousands. But its design was a masterpiece of controlled democracy, a system where the appearance of popular participation masked a deeply hierarchical reality. The entire structure was based on two intertwined pillars of Roman life, wealth and military service. The assembly was organized not by individuals, but into groups called centuries. The name itself is a giveaway. It harkens back to a military unit of 100 men. But in the voting context, the connection was more about order and hierarchy than head count. There were 193 of these centuries in total, and they were not created equal. Citizens were assigned to a specific century based on a property census. The wealthiest class, known as the equestrians or knights, those who could afford to serve as cavalry with their own horse and full armor, were placed in just 18 centuries. The next wealthiest class, the first class of infantry, who could bear the full heavy armor of a legionary, made up another 80 centuries. Now, here's the mechanism of control that made this system so potent. Each century, regardless of whether it contained 50 men or 500, was granted exactly one vote. The votes were not tallied based on the individual voices within the century. The majority opinion of the members of that single century determined its one collective vote. This immediately gave a small group of wealthy citizens in the top centuries an enormous, disproportionate share of the electoral power. But the Romans added another layer that made the system virtually unstoppable. The voting order was fixed, and it always began with the equestrian centuries, followed by the first class of infantry. They would vote one by one, and their results were announced immediately. If these 98 wealthy centuries, the knights and the first class all agreed on a candidate or a measure, they had already achieved a majority of the 193 total votes. The matter was decided. The remaining 95 centuries, comprising the vast majority of Rome's poorer citizen population, never even got to cast their vote. Their political voice was silenced by procedure before they could even utter a word. It was a system that legally and systematically prioritized the opinions of the wealthy elite, ensuring that the state's most crucial decisions aligned with the interests of those who had the most to lose or gain. To understand the sheer impact, consider a modern analogy. It's akin to an electoral college where the voting power of each state is determined not by its population, but by the average income of its residents. Imagine if the 10 wealthiest states, with a fraction of the total population, controlled enough electoral votes to decide the presidency before any other state could participate. That was the engineered reality of the Comitia Centuriata. It presented the image of a republic where every citizen had a role, but in practice, it was a brilliant political tool for maintaining stability through elite control. The system acknowledged the need for popular participation while meticulously ensuring that the aristocracy could steer the ship of state, preventing what they feared most: the unpredictable will of the masses from overwhelming the reasoned judgment of the established and propertied classes. While the Centuriata handled the grand affairs of war and high office, the day-to-day engine of Roman lawmaking and governance was the Comitia Tributa, the tribal assembly. This body was the true workhorse of the republic. responsible for electing a wide range of officials from the aediles who managed public festivals and city maintenance to the quaestors who oversaw the state treasury. Crucially, it was also the primary assembly for passing binding legislation on the vast majority of issues affecting Roman citizens. Its structure was different from the Centuriata, rooted not in military class but in geography, yet it was engineered to produce a similarly controlled outcome. Citizens were divided into 35 distinct voting blocks known as tribes. The name is a little misleading. These weren't necessarily based on ethnicity or ancient kinship. Initially, they were simply a way to organize the Roman populace by where they lived or where their family's ancestral land was located. Over time, as Rome expanded, the system became more complex. 4 of these tribes were designated as urban, covering the densely populated city of Rome itself. The remaining 31 were rural tribes, representing the surrounding countryside and territories throughout Italy. Your membership in a tribe was hereditary, passed down from father to son, meaning that even if your family moved to the city generations ago, you might still be voting in a rural tribe based on your distant ancestors' farm. The voting procedure itself was a fascinating 2-part process. When a law was proposed or an election was held, the tribes would not vote all at once as individuals. Instead, each tribe would gather separately to discuss and debate the matter amongst themselves. Picture 35 different huddles across the forum, each a microcosm of political debate. After this internal deliberation, the members of each tribe would then take a vote. The majority opinion within that single tribe determined its official, collective vote. So, rather than counting hundreds of thousands of individual voices, the final result was a simple tally of 35 total votes, one from each tribe. A majority of 18 tribes was needed to pass a law or elect a magistrate. This is where the system's inherent bias becomes strikingly clear. The 4 urban tribes contain the overwhelming majority of Rome's citizen population: the shopkeepers, artisans, laborers, and urban poor who crowded into the city. The 31 rural tribes, by contrast, were composed of the more affluent landowning class, who could afford to make the journey into Rome to vote when important matters were at stake. The consequence was a profound inequality of influence. A citizen in a densely packed urban tribe found his vote heavily diluted among thousands of others, all competing to determine their tribe's single, collective voice. Meanwhile, a wealthy landowner in a sparsely populated rural tribe wielded a much more powerful individual vote in shaping his tribe's outcome. This structure systematically favored the conservative, propertied interests of the countryside over the more volatile and numerous urban populace. The rural elite, with their 31 votes, could easily outmuscle the 4 votes of the urban masses on virtually any issue. It was another masterful Roman innovation in managed democracy. It gave the appearance of broad participation while ensuring that the traditional aristocracy and landowning class could reliably steer the legislative agenda. The system was designed for stability, prioritizing the interests of those with a permanent stake in the land, the very bedrock of the Roman economy, over the transient and often unpredictable demands of the urban crowd. Of all the responsibilities shouldered by the Comitia Centuriata, none carried more weight than the solemn power to declare war. This was not merely a political act, it was a sacred rite, a moment where the Republic formally committed its people, its gods, and its future to a path of bloodshed and conquest. The process was steeped in ancient ritual, designed to ensure that the decision was not made lightly and that it carried the full, divine-sanctioned authority of the Roman people. Before a single vote could be cast in the Centuriate Assembly, the matter had to be thoroughly debated in the Senate. The senators, Rome's advisory council of elder statesmen and former magistrates, would weigh the strategic necessities, the potential threats, and the economic costs of military action. They would hear envoys from foreign powers and receive reports from generals on the frontiers. Only after this exhaustive deliberation would the Senate vote on whether to recommend that the consuls bring the question of war before the people. This interplay is crucial to understand, the Senate advised, but only the sovereign people, gathered in their centuries, could legally unleash the legions. Once the consuls officially presented the question to the assembly, the atmosphere in the forum would shift from political to profoundly spiritual. The presiding magistrate, often a consul himself, would don his red war cloak and call upon the gods to witness the proceedings. He would then perform a series of elaborate rituals, the most important of which involved the official priests, a special college dedicated to the rites of war and peace. These priests were the guardians of international law and divine protocol. According to tradition, they would travel to the border of the hostile nation and formally demand restitution for whatever grievance had provoked Rome. If their demands were refused, they would return to Rome and declare that a just war, a bellum iustum, was now morally permissible. With the religious groundwork laid, the voting could begin. The citizens, organized by their wealth-based centuries, would now decide the fate of nations. Imagine the gravity of that moment. A yes vote meant authorizing the levy, the dioctus, where fathers and sons would be conscripted into the legions. It meant committing the state's treasury to fund a campaign that could last for years. It meant accepting the near certainty of casualties, of mourning families, and the unpredictable fortunes of battle. The stakes could not have been higher. A single vote here could set in motion the conquest of a new province, or trigger a disaster that threatened the city itself. And yet, as we've seen, this momentous decision was not truly in the hands of the entire Roman people. Because of the weighted voting system of the Centuriate Assembly, the choice for war or peace rested overwhelmingly with the wealthiest citizens. The 18 equestrian centuries and the 80 centuries of the first class, representing the men who could afford the finest military equipment, held 98 votes, a majority. If they were in agreement, the matter was decided before the vast majority of common citizens, the very men who would form the bulk of the infantry and bear the greatest risk in the coming fighting, ever had a chance to express their will. This reveals a profound and calculated logic behind the Roman system. The elite, who had the most wealth to lose in a failed war, but also the most to gain in land and spoils from a successful one, were given the ultimate authority. Their vote was a declaration that they were not only willing to fund the war, but also confident that their interests were synonymous with Rome's. The system ensured that the decision for war was made by those with a material stake in its outcome, effectively filtering out the potential hesitation of the poorer masses who might prioritize safety over expansion. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation that placed the empire's aggressive destiny firmly in the hands of its most ambitious and prosperous citizens. While the Centuriata handled matters of war and high office, the true engine of everyday governance and lawmaking was the Comitia Centuriata, the tribal assembly. This body served as the primary legislative power for the Roman Republic, a dynamic institution where the laws governing everything from citizenship to debt were debated and decided. Its power was immense, shaping the daily lives of all Romans, yet its procedures were a world away from our modern concept of a legislature. The entire process began not with the people, but with a magistrate. Only a senior official, such as a consul, praetor, or a tribune of the plebs, possessed the right to bring a proposed law, known as a rogatio, before the assembly. This magistrate would first publicly post the text of the proposal, allowing citizens to read it for themselves. He would then convene a series of public meetings, called contiens, which were not voting sessions but rather elaborate forums for debate and persuasion. Here, the magistrate would argue for his law, and more importantly, other citizens, both supporters and opponents, would mount the speaker's platform to voice their opinions. These were dramatic, theatrical events, where skilled orators could sway public sentiment with powerful rhetoric, emotional appeals, and shrewd political arguments. The fate of a law was often decided not in the silent act of voting, but in the roaring, unpredictable theater of public opinion. When the day of the actual vote arrived, the procedure was a fascinating two-stage event that underscored the collective nature of Roman politics. The 35 tribes were called to assemble in their designated areas within the forum. Before any voting could occur, each tribe would first gather as a smaller, self-contained unit to deliberate internally. Picture this: 35 different huddles of citizens spread across the open space, each group passionately discussing the merits and flaws of the proposed law amongst themselves. This was direct democracy in its rawest form, a chance for every citizen within a tribe to have his say and attempt to persuade his neighbors. After this lively debate, the members of the tribe would then take a vote. The majority opinion within that single tribe determined its official, collective stance. The final result was not a tally of thousands of individual ballots, but a simple count of 35 total votes, one from each tribe. A majority of just 18 tribes was needed to pass a law, making it legally binding on all Roman citizens. This system produced some of the most significant and controversial legislation in Roman history. Landmark laws, like the Lex Hortensia of 287 BCE, which granted decisions made by the plebeian council the force of law for all citizens, were passed through this tribal process. Major reforms concerning the distribution of public land to the poor, laws extending citizenship rights to allied Italian communities, and regulations on debt and grain prices all emerged from the votes cast in the Comitia Centuriata. Yet, for all its power to shape society, the system was notoriously vulnerable to manipulation by savvy and powerful politicians. The very structure of the tribes, with their hereditary membership and geographic disparities, created easy targets for influence. A wealthy politician could focus his campaign efforts and resources on swaying the key rural tribes, knowing that their votes carried disproportionate weight. Since many landowners in these tribes lived far from Rome and could not always afford the journey to vote, a candidate might arrange and pay for their travel and lodging, creating a sense of obligation that was expected to be repaid at the ballot. This practice, while not always illegal, blurred the line between legitimate campaigning and outright bribery. Furthermore, the order in which the tribes voted was determined by lot, and a quick victory among the first few tribes called could create a powerful bandwagon effect, pressuring later tribes to fall in line. The integrity of the process constantly hinged on the thin line between persuasive debate and manipulative coercion, revealing a system that was brilliantly designed for participation, but ultimately just as susceptible to the influence of power and wealth as any other. But if the Centuriata and Tributa were the formal organs of the Roman state, there was another assembly that represented something far more radical, the raw, unvarnished voice of the common people. This was the Concilium Plebis, the Council of the Plebeians, and its story is one of the most dramatic power struggles in ancient history. Born from conflict and desperation, it evolved from a protest movement into a legitimate political force that fundamentally reshaped the Roman Republic. Its journey forces us to ask a critical question. Did it truly give power to the people, or did it simply force the elite to find new and more clever ways to maintain control? The origins of the plebeian council lie in a period of intense social upheaval known as the Struggle of the Orders, a political conflict that stretched for over 2 centuries. In the early Republic, Roman society was brutally divided between two classes: the patricians, a small, exclusive aristocracy who claimed descent from the original founding fathers of Rome, and the plebeians, who constituted the vast majority of the population, everyone from wealthy non-patrician merchants to poor farmers and urban laborers. The patricians monopolized all political power, religious offices, and the interpretation of the law, which was unwritten and therefore easily manipulated. Plebeians were shut out completely, and they also bore the heaviest burdens of military service and debt. The situation reached a boiling point in the early 5th century BCE, when, according to tradition, the plebeians staged a kind of general strike. They literally seceded from the city, withdrawing to the sacred mount outside Rome's boundaries and refusing to serve in the army until their grievances were addressed. This act of mass defiance was their ultimate bargaining chip, and it worked. To secure their return, the patricians were forced to recognize the plebeians' right to their own assembly, the Concilium Plebis, and to elect their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs. These tribunes were unlike any other magistrates. Their power, known as sacrosanctitas, was rooted in the oath sworn by the entire plebeian order to protect them. Anyone who harmed a tribune could be killed on the spot without trial. Their primary weapon was the veto, the power to literally forbid any action by a magistrate or any decree of the Senate that they deemed harmful to the plebeians. They were the living, breathing embodiment of the people's right to resist oppression. The concilium plebis itself operated similarly to the tribal assembly, voting by the same 35 tribes. But with one crucial difference: patricians were strictly forbidden from participating. This was the people's house. Its original decisions, called plebiscita, from which we get our word plebiscite, were initially only binding on the plebeians themselves. For generations, the patrician Senate simply ignored them. But over time, through relentless pressure and further secessions, the plebeians forced concession after concession. They gained the right to intermarry with patricians, access to the highest offices of state, and finally, in a monumental victory, the force of law for their decisions. That victory was cemented by the Lex Hortensia in 287 BCE, named after the plebeian dictator Quintus Hortensius who passed it. This law declared that any plebiscitum passed by the concilium plebis would have the full force of law, binding on all Romans, patrician and plebeian alike. This was a revolutionary moment. It meant that a body entirely composed of commoners, operating outside the direct control of the Senate, could now make laws for the entire republic. On the surface, this was the ultimate triumph of popular sovereignty. The people, through their tribunes and their council, finally had a direct and unassailable legislative voice. But did this seismic shift truly empower the average Roman? The reality is far more complex and much less rosy. While the legal barrier fell, social and economic barriers remained toweringly high. To be a tribune and propose legislation, you needed to be a persuasive public speaker, have ample free time to engage in politics, and possess the resources to campaign qualities that were still largely the domain of the wealthy. Consequently, the leadership of the plebeian movement was quickly co-opted by wealthy, ambitious plebeian families who had little in common with the poor masses they claimed to represent. These men, often called the nobiles, saw the tribunate not as a sacred duty to the people, but as a perfect stepping stone to greater personal power and a brilliant platform to challenge the patrician old guard. The concilium plebis, therefore, became less a vehicle for genuine popular reform and more a new arena for elite competition. Ambitious politicians quickly learned to harness the raw power of the people's assembly for their own ends. They would propose popular but often reckless laws, land redistributions, debt cancellations, free grain, to win the fervent support of the masses and build a personal political army that could intimidate the Senate. The people got bread and circuses, while the politician got influence and glory. The system designed to protect the common man from the elite became, in the hands of a skilled populist, the most powerful tool an elite could wield. The Lex Hortensia didn't erase the class struggle. It just changed the battlefield, proving that a law granting power is one thing, but the resources and cunning to wield it effectively are quite another. Now, let's step into the actual voting area and witness the mechanics of the process itself. For centuries, the fundamental act of voting in Rome was a public spectacle. In the early days of the Republic, a citizen's choice was anything but private. Voting was conducted either by voice, known as viva voce, where you would literally shout your vote for all to hear, or by a show of hands. Imagine the immense social pressure of that moment, standing in your century or tribe, surrounded by your peers, your neighbors, and most importantly, your patrons, the wealthy men to whom you might owe your livelihood, your land, or your family's safety. To vote against the wishes of a powerful man was not just a political act. It could be a social and economic gamble with real consequences. Your voice and your raised hand were open declarations of loyalty or defiance. This very public nature of voting created a system ripe for intimidation and influence. A wealthy patron could stand at the edge of his tribe's gathering, his eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring his clients were fulfilling their unwritten obligations. The potential for bribery was also immense. How could you prove you voted for a candidate if your vote was secret? And conversely, How could a candidate be sure you upheld your end of a bargain if he couldn't witness your vote? The system protected the interests of the powerful by making the political allegiance of their dependents a matter of public record. But a revolution was brewing, one that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the citizen and the state. Starting in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, a series of 3 groundbreaking laws began to transfer the act of voting from the public square into the private hand of the individual voter. These were the ballot laws, and they were among the most significant democratic reforms in Roman history. The first was the Lex Gabinia of 139 BCE, introduced by the tribune Aulus Gabinius. This law mandated the use of a secret ballot in elections for public office, except for the highest rank of censor. No longer would you have to call out the name of your preferred candidate. Your choice could now be confidential. Just 2 years later, the Lex Cassia of 137 BCE, passed by the tribune Lucius Cassius Longinus, extended this secret ballot to most popular trials held before the people, where citizens acted as jurors. Finally, in 131 BCE, the Lex Papiria, sponsored by the tribune Gaius Papirius Carbo, completed the trifecta by applying the secret ballot to the passage of legislation. The speed and scope of these reforms tell us just how intense the popular demand for electoral integrity had become. The common people, tired of being strong-armed by the elite, fought for and won a measure of true political independence. The driving force behind these laws was a clear and growing frustration with the blatant coercion and open bribery that had come to plague the Comitia. Political corruption was rampant, with candidates offering direct payments, lavish feasts, and promises of favors in exchange for votes. The secret ballot was a direct counterattack on this system. It gave the average voter a shield. He could now accept a bribe from one candidate, face the intimidating gaze of another, and yet in the solitude of the voting booth, vote according to his own conscience without fear of reprisal. It was a tool designed to break the chains of obligation and allow the will of the people, however imperfectly organized, to be expressed more freely. This monumental shift set the stage for the most tangible artifact of Roman democracy we have, the ballot itself. So with the introduction of the secret ballot, the physical object a voter held in his hand became a powerful symbol of his newfound political independence. This object was the tabella, a simple yet ingeniously designed wooden tablet. Picture a small handheld plank, perhaps the size of a modern smartphone, with a shallow recess carved into its center. This hollowed-out section was then filled with a thin layer of colored beeswax, creating a smooth, malleable surface. This wax coating was the key to the entire system. It provided a temporary, reusable, and easily observable writing surface. A voter would use a small metal stylus to etch his choice into the wax, a deliberate and physical act of decision-making. The specific markings they scratched were deeply symbolic and followed a clear, almost universal code. For legislative votes, where one was simply approving or rejecting a proposed law, the choices were stark. To vote in favor, a citizen would carefully inscribe a single letter into the wax, a V. This stood for Iudi rogas, a Latin phrase meaning, as you propose. It was a vote of affirmation, agreement with the magistrate's motion. To vote against the proposal, the voter would scratch an A for antiquo. This word is fascinating. It doesn't just mean no. It carries a much heavier connotation, translating roughly to I reject it, or even I keep the old way. It was a conservative term, a defense of the status quo against change. In judicial trials held before the people, the same letters were used but with different meanings. A for absolvo, I acquit, and C for condemno, I condemn. When it came to elections, the process became slightly more personal. The voter would use his stylus to write out the full name, or at least the recognizable abbreviation, of his chosen candidate directly into the wax. This could be a time-consuming process, especially for those with less education, and it undoubtedly contributed to the slow, deliberate pace of Roman voting days. Once his choice was recorded, the voter would perform one final, crucial act. He would carefully fold his tabella closed, pinching the wooden edges together to conceal the marked wax inside. His vote was now his own private secret, hidden from the watchful eyes of patrons and politicians alike. This folded tablet was then carried to a large, wide-mouthed basket called a cista. These baskets were placed under the strict guard of officials known as custodes, who were often trusted men from allied Italian communities, chosen for their perceived neutrality in Roman political squabbles. The voter would approach the cista, extend his arm over the open top, and drop his folded ballot inside. The soft thud of wood on wood was the sound of a democracy evolving, of individual will being physically deposited into the collective pool. The custodes would later empty the baskets and publicly count the folded tablets, unfolding each one to reveal the choice within and tallying the results for all to see. The logistical effort behind this process was staggering. For a single election or legislative vote, the state had to produce tens of thousands of these identical wax tablets. This required a small industry of woodworkers, beekeepers for the wax, and metal workers for the style. While no perfectly preserved examples of a Roman voting tablet have been found, archaeologists have discovered numerous style and wax tablets used for everyday writing in places like Pompeii and Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall. These finds give us a clear picture of the very objects that would have been used in the forum. We also have the angry words of the elites who felt their power slipping away. The orator Cicero, a champion of the aristocratic cause, lamented the ballot laws, complaining that they deprived the aristocracy of all its influence. He saw the secret ballot not as a protection for liberty, but as a shield for irresponsibility, allowing the common voter to ignore the guidance of his social betters. The humble tabella, a simple piece of wood and wax, had become the most potent weapon in the plebeian arsenal and the greatest frustration of the Roman elite. Imagine the energy of a modern election day, then multiply it by a factor of ancient Roman spectacle. Election days in the Republic were not quiet affairs held in sterile polling stations. They were grand public festivals, pulsating with a unique blend of civic duty, raw ambition, and sheer chaos. The entire city seemed to shift its focus to one location. For meetings of the tribal assembly, the heart of the action was the Forum Romanum, the bustling civic center nestled between the Capitoline and Palatine hills. But for the all-important elections of consuls and praetors, held by the Centuriate Assembly, the venue shifted to the Campus Martius, the field of Mars. This vast, open plain outside the city's sacred boundary was originally a military training ground, a fitting backdrop for an assembly built on military principles. Here, free from the religious restrictions that governed space within the city walls, the Roman people could gather in their full electoral might. The scene on arrival was overwhelming. From before sunrise, citizens would stream across the Tiber River, flowing into the Campus Martius like a human tide. The air would be thick with the din of thousands of conversations, the shouts of food vendors capitalizing on the crowd, and the frantic last-minute appeals of candidates and their supporters. There were no microphones, no loudspeakers, just the raw power of the human voice trying to rise above the cacophony. The wealthy elite, the candidates themselves, would be unmistakable, dressed in their snow-white togas bleached to a brilliant chalky whiteness, a symbol of their purity and dedication to the Republic. They would work the crowd relentlessly, clasping forearms, calling voters by name, and making one final, personal plea. Their supporters, known as nomenclators, would flank them, whispering the names of approaching citizens into their ears so the candidate could offer a personalized and seemingly intimate greeting. The proceedings were presided over by a senior magistrate, often a consul if one was in office. His first act was to take the auspices to seek the approval of the gods by watching the sky for signs, such as the flight patterns of birds. A negative omen could postpone the entire election, a tense moment of vulnerability for every candidate who had invested fortunes in their campaign. If the gods gave their blessing, the practical work could begin. Officials fanned out through the crowd. The rogators were tasked with one of the most crucial jobs, distributing the thousands of wooden tabulae, the voting tablets, to the citizens as they were called forward by their century or tribe. Meanwhile, the custodes, the guards, took up their positions by the large voting baskets, the cisti. Their role was paramount, to ensure the integrity of the physical vote, to prevent tampering with the baskets, and to oversee the counting later. Chosen for their neutrality, often from allied Italian towns with no direct stake in the outcome, they were the silent guardians of the process. The order of voting was everything, and it was designed to be as fair as possible through random chance. The presiding magistrate would oversee a lottery to determine which tribe or century would have the privilege and immense influence of voting first. This random selection, the sortidio, was a moment of high drama. The tribe or century chosen to go first was called the prerogativa, and its vote was considered powerfully indicative of the final result. A win in the prerogativa was a tremendous psychological victory for a candidate, creating a bandwagon effect that could sway the votes of the subsequent groups. As Plutarch noted, it was a common belief that the outcome did not usually disappoint the voters' expectations, suggesting how much weight this first vote carried in shaping the consensus of the day. Yet for all its grandeur, the process was fraught with logistical nightmares. There was no indoor seating, no protection from the elements. An election could be delayed or even abandoned due to a sudden downpour that turned the Campus Martius into a muddy quagmire, washing the wax right off the tablets. The sheer size of the crowd meant everything moved at a glacial pace. Voting by century, with each of the 193 groups needing to be called forward one after another, file past the rogators to get their tablet, mark it in relative privacy, and then deposit it, could take the entire day. The potential for chaos was ever present. Supporters of rival candidates might clash, leading to scuffles or outright riots. The crowd itself could grow restless, impatient, or be swayed by a clever rumor planted at just the right moment. It was a fragile, messy, and profoundly human system, a monumental effort of organization dedicated to the singular purpose of capturing the will of the people, one wax tablet at a time. But for all its grand ritual and careful design, the Roman electoral system had a deep and persistent flaw, a cancer that eroded its integrity from within, the pervasive, almost institutionalized, practice of bribery. If the secret ballot was the people's shield, then bribery was the elite's relentless sword, constantly probing for weaknesses. The competition for high office was so fierce, the rewards of victory so immense, that many candidates saw the investment in votes not as a crime, but as a necessary cost of doing political business. This wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a systemic issue the Romans themselves had a specific word for: ambitus, the crime of electoral corruption. The methods of bribery were as varied as they were brazen. The most straightforward was the direct cash payment. Politicians would employ specialized agents known as divisors. These men were not mere errand boys. They were highly organized operators with detailed knowledge of the tribal and century system. A candidate would funnel money to a divisor, who would then be responsible for distributing the cash to the right members of the right voting blocks. They knew exactly which tribes or centuries were pivotal, which ones could be swayed for the right price, and how to efficiently get the money into the hands of the voters who mattered most. It was a cold, calculated system of vote buying that treated the electorate not as sovereign citizens, but as a market to be purchased. But cash was crude and left a paper trail. More sophisticated, and perhaps more effective, was the indirect bribe. A wealthy candidate would host lavish public banquets for entire tribes, serving expensive delicacies and fine wine. He might sponsor extravagant games, gladiatorial contests, or theatrical performances, not out of civic generosity, but as a blatant advertisement for his candidacy. These events were accompanied by subtle, or not so subtle hints about the gratitude the sponsor would feel if supported on election day. Another powerful tool was the promise of future favors. A candidate might pledge a lucrative government contract, a desirable priesthood, or legal support in an upcoming court case to an influential community leader in exchange for delivering the votes of his entire tribe or guild. This created a cascading system of obligation. where a single bribe at the top could influence dozens, even hundreds of votes below. The scale of this problem is vividly illustrated by famous court cases that scandalized Rome. One of the most notorious was the trial of Marcus Aemilius Scaurus in 52 BCE. Scaurus, a prominent noble, was accused of staggering levels of electoral bribery during his campaign for the consulship. The prosecution alleged he had orchestrated a complex scheme involving divisors, massive loans from sympathetic allies, and promises of provincial governorships to his key supporters. While Scaurus was ultimately acquitted, largely due to his immense political influence and an expertly delivered defense, the trial exposed the open secret of Roman elections. Success often depended not on merit, but on the depth of one's coffers and the ruthlessness of one's operatives. The Roman state was not blind to this corruption. The Senate passed a series of laws, leges de ambitu, specifically designed to curb these practices. The Lex Cornelia Bibia of 1801 BCE was one of the earliest, imposing penalties that included disqualification from holding future office for a period of 10 years. Later laws became increasingly severe. The Lex Aecilia Calpurnia of 67 BCE mandated exile for convicted offenders, and the Lex Tullia of 63 BCE, sponsored by none other than Cicero, extended the period of exile to 10 years. Yet for all their increasing harshness, these laws were notoriously difficult to enforce. Prosecuting a wealthy, well-connected politician was a dangerous undertaking. Witnesses could be intimidated or bribed themselves. Juries were often composed of fellow senators who might be sympathetic or wary of setting a precedent that could later be used against them. And the line between legitimate campaign generosity and illegal bribery was intentionally blurry. A public feast could be framed as traditional Roman largesse. A gift could be explained as an act of friendship. The laws were like sieves, and the clever candidates always found a way to slip through. This relentless cycle of corruption and half-hearted reform forces us to confront a difficult question. Was the Roman system inherently corrupt, a fundamentally broken model that encouraged cheating, or was it merely a reflection of an unchanging aspect of human nature? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The structure of Roman politics, with its winner-take-all rewards, made corruption almost inevitable. The payoff for winning a consulship was a potential military command, which could lead to enormous wealth from plunder and tribute, enough to pay off all campaign debts and secure a family's fortune for generations. The stakes were so high that ethical considerations were often the first casualty. Yet, the constant public outrage over ambitus, the passing of new laws, and the occasional successful prosecution show that the Roman people had a clear ideal of what a fair election should be. They recognized the corrosive effect of money on their democracy and fought a continuous, if losing, battle against it. Their struggle mirrors our own modern debates about campaign finance and the influence of wealth in politics, suggesting that the tension between democratic ideals and the corrupting allure of power is not a flaw in any one system, but a permanent challenge in any society that asks its people to choose their leaders. Beyond the blatant exchange of cash for votes existed a far more subtle, yet deeply entrenched, system of influence that wove itself into the very fabric of Roman society: patronage. Known as clientela, this wasn't a corrupt scheme but a fundamental social contract, a network of mutual obligation that governed relationships from the highest senator to the lowest laborer. At its heart was the bond between a patronus, a wealthy and powerful man, and his clients, his dependents. For a client, having a patron was a lifeline. In a world with no social safety net, a patron provided crucial support. He might offer legal representation in a tricky court case, a loan to cover a bad harvest, or even a daily dole of food or a small sum of money known as a sportula. This was not charity, it was an investment. In return, the client owed his patron respect, public support, and most importantly on election day, his vote. This daily ritual of obligation was performed every morning in a ceremony called the salutatio. At dawn, a patron's home would open its doors, and a line of his clients would form, waiting to greet him. This was not a quick hello, it was a formal display of hierarchy and loyalty. The clients, dressed in their simple togas, would be ushered in one by one to pay their respects. A successful patron might be attended by dozens, even hundreds of clients, their very presence a visible measure of his social standing and political clout. After the greetings, the patron would often distribute the sportula, and then the clients would fall in behind him, forming a retinue that accompanied him through the streets to the forum. This morning parade was a powerful piece of political theater, a living demonstration of a man's influence for all of Rome to see. To walk through the city surrounded by a large, respectful crowd of dependents was to announce your importance without saying a word. When these processions converged on the voting areas of the Campus Martius or the Forum, the abstract concept of patronage met the concrete act of democracy. A client entered the voting space not as a free, independent citizen, but as a man bound by powerful ties of gratitude and duty. The unspoken pressure was immense. How could you, after accepting your patron's help and his money that very morning, walk into a voting booth and mark a tablet against his preferred candidate or his proposed law? To do so would be a profound breach of social etiquette, an act of ingratitude that could sever the relationship and cost you and your family their vital source of security. The system ensured that a patron's political will was amplified through the votes of his entire network of clients, effectively allowing him to vote many times over through his dependents. This created a constant, simmering tension between personal loyalty and civic duty. The ideal of the Republic was that a citizen should vote for the best candidate or the most beneficial law for the state as a whole. But the reality of clientela demanded that you vote for the best interests of your patron, which were often one and the same. The system brilliantly reinforced the existing social hierarchy, ensuring that political power remained concentrated in the hands of the elite. Wealthy men could translate their economic power directly into political capital by simply maintaining a large household of clients. It was a self-perpetuating cycle. Success in politics brought more prestige, which attracted more clients, which in turn delivered more votes for future success. While the secret ballot offered a sliver of anonymity, the entire weight of Roman social tradition pressed upon the voter's hand as he etched his choice into the wax, a silent reminder that his vote was never truly his own. Standing in the shadow of the grand temples and bustling crowds of the Forum, a Roman woman experienced the vibrant life of the Republic from a distinct and separate sphere. The roar of the assemblies, the casting of the ballots, the election of magistrates, these were the affairs of men. By law and by custom, women were entirely excluded from the formal mechanisms of political power. They could not vote, they could not hold office, they could not even address a political gathering without causing a scandal. Yet, to conclude that women were therefore powerless or that politics was a purely masculine domain is to misunderstand the intricate social fabric of Rome. While barred from the polls, women of influence, particularly those from elite families, mastered the art of political maneuvering behind the scenes, operating through unofficial channels that were often just as potent as a vote cast in the comitia. This political influence was most effectively wielded within the trusted networks of family and social obligation. A high-born Roman woman was not a secluded figure, but a central player in managing her household's social capital. She was often highly educated, financially astute, and deeply aware of the political currents shaping the Republic. Her primary avenue for influence was through the men in her life, her father, her husband, and her sons. Through private counsel, strategic advice, and by leveraging her own web of friendships and alliances with other powerful families, she could shape policy, advance careers, and protect her family's interests. A wife might persuade her husband to support a certain law. A mother could guide her son's political ambitions. These conversations happened not in the Senate House but in the home, the domus, which was far from a private refuge. It was the very headquarters of a political family's operations. Perhaps the most striking public example of this influence breaking into the open is the story of Hortensia in 42 BCE. During the turbulent period of the Second Triumvirate, the ruling faction needed vast sums of money to fund their war against the assassins of Julius Caesar. They decided to impose a heavy tax on the 1,400 wealthiest women in Rome. These women had no vote, no formal way to protest this decree through the political system. So they did something extraordinary. They marched en masse to the Forum and confronted the triumvirs directly. Led by Hortensia, the daughter of the famed orator Quintus Hortensius, they delivered a powerful and logical speech that has been preserved by the historian Appian. Hortensia's argument was brilliant. Why should they pay for a war in which they had no voice? They did not hold office, they did not declare wars, and they derived no benefit from political victories. To tax them for a conflict they had no part in starting was a profound injustice. Her eloquence and sheer audacity shamed the triumvirs. They were so taken aback by this public challenge that they reduced the number of women liable for the tax to just 400. It was a monumental victory for informal power, a clear demonstration that even without a vote, a woman's voice, when raised collectively and courageously, could alter the course of state policy. A fascinating exception that proves the rule of female exclusion was the unique status of the Vestal Virgins. These 6 priestesses, chosen in childhood to serve the goddess Vesta for 30 years, occupied a paradoxical position in Roman society. They were the only women who were not under the legal control of a male guardian, or paterfamilias. They could own property, make wills, and even testify in court without taking an oath. Their persons were inviolable, and their presence could pardon a condemned man. In many ways, they held privileges and a level of public respect that other women could only dream of. They had a reserved seat of honor at public games and ceremonies, and their opinions were sought by the highest magistrates on matters of ritual and tradition. Yet, for all their immense social and religious authority, they still possessed no formal political power. They could not vote. They could not address an assembly unless it was on a matter of their sacred duties. Their influence was immense but entirely indirect, channeled through their sanctity and their unique access to the powerful men who revered them. The Vestals represent the ceiling of female political participation in the Republic, unparalleled social standing and respect, but a complete lack of any official, constitutionally recognized voice in the state's governance. This systemic exclusion from citizenship's most fundamental right had a profound and lasting impact, shaping not just Roman society, but the very foundations of Western political thought. By defining the active political citizen as exclusively male, Rome enshrined a principle that would echo for millennia. It created a public sphere dominated by men and a private sphere where women could exercise influence, but only through intermediaries and without official recognition. This legacy was passed directly to the Enlightenment thinkers who looked to Rome as their model for republicanism. When they spoke of the rights of man and designed their own democracies, they often unconsciously, and sometimes consciously, inherited Rome's gendered limitations. The fight for women's suffrage centuries later was not just a fight against contemporary prejudice, but in many ways, a fight against a deeply embedded classical ideal that separated the virtues of the public citizen from the capacities of women. The silent, unmarked tabulae in the voting baskets tell only half the story of Roman politics. The other half is written in the determined voices of women like Hortensia, who demanded to be heard from the margins of the Forum. For a man who had spent his life in bondage, the moment of manumission was nothing short of a rebirth. Legally freed by his master, he stepped into the light as a Roman citizen, a liberatus or freedman. This was one of the most remarkable and unique features of Roman society, the legal pathway from enslaved person to citizen. With citizenship came the coveted right to vote, the suffragium. In an instant, a man who had been considered property, with no legal personhood of his own, could now participate in the highest act of a Roman citizen, influencing the government of the Republic. Yet, this newfound political power came with a significant and telling catch. A mechanism designed to ensure his voice would only ever be a whisper in the political arena. The moment a freedman received his freedom, the Roman state immediately classified him. For voting purposes, he was not distributed among the full 35 tribes. Instead, he was automatically enrolled into one of the 4 urban tribes. On the surface, this might seem like a simple administrative act, but in the engineered world of Roman voting, it was a profound political demotion. As we've seen, the 4 urban tribes were where the massive population of Rome's city dwellers was concentrated. Their votes were dramatically diluted. Each urban tribe contained tens of thousands of men, all fighting to determine that tribe's single collective vote. Meanwhile, a sparsely populated rural tribe, comprised of wealthy landowners, might have only a few hundred members determining its vote, giving each individual within it far greater influence. By corralling all freedmen into these 4 overcrowded urban tribes, the Roman elite effectively neutralized their political impact. They could vote, but their vote was systematically engineered to count for very little. This policy reveals a deep-seated anxiety and a clear social hierarchy among Roman citizens. The elite viewed freedmen with a mixture of dependence and disdain. They depended on them as a source of labor, skilled craftsmen, and often as business managers who ran their commercial affairs. Many freedmen went on to become remarkably wealthy and successful. Yet socially, they were often looked down upon. There was a stigma attached to their past enslavement, a perception that they were not truly the equals of free-born citizens. Granting them citizenship was a pragmatic move, a way to integrate a large and economically vital population. But restricting their voting power to the urban tribes was a way to uphold the social order, ensuring that this new class of citizens, despite their numbers and growing wealth, could not disrupt the political control held by the traditional landowning aristocracy. There were, however, rare and notable exceptions that proved the rule. The state could, as an extraordinary reward for great service, grant a freedman enrollment into a rural tribe. This was a monumental honor, a recognition that lifted a man and his descendants out of the political margins. One of the most famous recipients of this privilege was the writer Publius Terentius of Fur, known to us as Terence. Born in North Africa, he was brought to Rome as an enslaved person, but was later freed by his master, the senator Terentius Lucanus, who recognized his brilliant intellect. Terence went on to become one of Rome's greatest playwrights. While the historical record is not entirely clear, strong traditions suggest that his immense cultural contribution to Rome was so valued that he was granted the rare honor of membership in a rural tribe. This exception highlights the rigid norm. Such a reward was remarkable precisely because the standard practice was so deliberately restrictive. The experience of freedmen perfectly encapsulates the Roman concept of citizenship. It was not a monolithic status conferring equal rights, but a layered and hierarchical one. You could be a citizen, but your value, your dignitas, and your political clout were determined by a host of other factors: your birth, your wealth, your ancestry, and your reputation. The voting system was meticulously designed to reflect and reinforce this social pyramid. The freedman, even at his most wealthy and successful, occupied a specific and limited rung on this ladder. He had a voice, but the system was engineered to ensure it was a voice that spoke from the crowded, less influential quarters of the political world. This careful calibration shows us that for the Romans, the integrity of the vote was less important than the integrity of the social order. A hierarchy they believed was essential for the stability and glory of their republic. Yet for all its grand ritual and careful design, this very public system of voting had a deep and persistent flaw, a cancer that eroded its integrity from within: the pervasive, almost institutionalized, practice of bribery and intimidation. If the secret ballot would later become the people's shield, then the open vote was the elite's most powerful weapon, allowing them to witness and enforce the political obedience of their dependents. The competition for high office was so fierce, the rewards of victory so immense, that the entire process was vulnerable to coercion. A wealthy patron could stand at the edge of his tribe's gathering, his eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring his clients were fulfilling their unwritten obligations. The potential for bribery was also immense. How could you prove you voted for a candidate if your vote was secret? And conversely, How could a candidate be sure you upheld your end of a bargain if he couldn't witness your vote? The system protected the interests of the powerful by making the political allegiance of their dependents a matter of public record. But a revolution was brewing, one that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the citizen and the state, and it arrived in the form of 3 groundbreaking laws known collectively as the leges tabellari, the ballot laws. These were among the most significant democratic reforms in Roman history, a direct response to the public's fury over the blatant coercion and open corruption that had come to plague the assemblies. The first and most monumental was the Lex Gabinia of 139 BCE, introduced by the tribune Aulus Gabinius. This law mandated the use of a secret ballot in elections for all public offices, a stunning blow to the established order. No longer would a citizen have to call out the name of his preferred candidate for all to hear. His choice could now be confidential, a private matter between himself and the wax tablet. Just 2 years later, the push for electoral integrity gained even more momentum with the Lex Cassia of 137 BCE. This law, passed by the tribune Lucius Cassius Longinus, extended the protection of the secret ballot to most popular trials held before the people, where citizens acted as jurors deciding the fates of the accused. However, in a telling exception that revealed the limits of this new transparency, votes in trials for treason, or perdulio, were still conducted openly. The state deemed matters of national security too grave for private judgment, insisting on public accountability even at the cost of potential intimidation. Finally, in 131 BCE, the Lex Papiria, sponsored by the tribune Gaius Papirius Carbo, completed this legislative trifecta by applying the secret ballot to the third major function of the citizenry, the passage of legislation itself. The speed and scope of these reforms tell us just how intense the popular demand for a shielded vote had become. The common people, tired of being strong-armed by the elite, had fought for and won a measure of true political independence. The motivations behind these laws were clear and practical. They were a direct counterattack on the twin evils of ambitious electoral bribery and vis intimidation. The secret ballot gave the average voter a crucial shield. He could now accept a bribe from one candidate, face the intimidating gaze of another, and yet in the solitude of the voting booth, vote according to his own conscience without fear of immediate reprisal. It was a tool designed to break the chains of social obligation and allow the will of the people, however imperfectly organized, to be expressed more freely. Proponents argued that this was true liberty, the freedom to choose one's leaders without facing ruin for one's choice. Naturally, this seismic shift was met with fierce opposition from the conservative aristocracy, who saw it not as progress but as the unraveling of the republic's social fabric. Their most eloquent and stubborn spokesman was Cato the Younger, a senator renowned for his inflexible integrity and staunch defense of traditional values. Cato and his allies argued that the secret ballot didn't combat corruption. It simply made it more efficient and shameless. Under the old system, a patron could see if his client was loyal, and the community could witness a man voting against the common good. This visibility, they believed, fostered a sense of accountability and civic duty. With the secret ballot, a voter could take bribes from multiple candidates and betray them all with impunity. It encouraged irresponsible and fickle voting by removing the social checks and balances that came with public scrutiny. Cato famously argued that the Republic needed men of virtue to lead and citizens who would follow their guidance openly and proudly. Secrecy, in his view, was the refuge of the coward and the cheat. So did the reform work. The answer is as complex as Roman politics itself. On one hand, the ballot laws undoubtedly made outright voter intimidation far more difficult. The angry speeches from conservative senators like Cicero, lamenting that the aristocracy had lost all its influence, are themselves powerful testimony to the law's effect. It clearly worked well enough to infuriate the very men who had benefited from the old system. The people had clearly gained a new degree of autonomy. However, it did not spell the end of electoral corruption. It merely forced politicians to adapt their strategies. If they could no longer guarantee a vote through intimidation, they doubled down on the other tool at their disposal, bribery. The practice became even more brazen and organized, with specialized bribe distributors, the divisors, operating with sophisticated knowledge of the tribal system. The secret ballot may have protected the voter from repercussion after the fact, but it did nothing to stop the flow of money into his hands before he entered the booth. In many ways, it made bribery a safer investment for the politician, as he could now bribe with the confidence that the voter was protected from pressure by rival factions. The reform was a crucial step toward individual liberty, but it proved that no single law could ever fully eradicate the endless creativity of human ambition and corruption. So far, we've been walking the sun-baked stones of the Forum and the Campus Martius, surrounded by Roman citizens, but the Roman world was vastly larger than the city itself. At its height, the empire stretched from the rainy hills of northern Britain to the deserts of Syria, encompassing millions of people living in dozens of conquered provinces. This brings us to a profound and often overlooked question: what about everyone else? For the vast majority of people living under the Roman eagle, the elaborate voting rituals we've been exploring were completely inaccessible. To be a provincial was to live on the periphery of power, subject to the laws of Rome, but almost never invited to help make them. The fundamental barrier was citizenship. The right to vote in Roman assemblies was the exclusive privilege of a Roman citizen. For centuries, this status was jealously guarded and rarely granted to those outside of Italy. A Gallic farmer, a Greek scholar, or Egyptian merchant might pay taxes to Rome, obey Roman governors, and even serve in the auxiliary units of the Roman army. But they remained peregrini, foreigners in the eyes of the law. Their political world was local, confined to the affairs of their own city or tribe. The grand decisions of war, peace, and leadership that echoed through the Roman Forum were made in a distant capital by men who might never set foot in their homeland. This created a stark two-tiered system across the empire, a small core of citizen participants at the center, and a vast periphery of subject obiers with no formal voice in their own imperial government. There was, however, a narrow path to inclusion for the most privileged provincials. The Roman elite understood that the best way to maintain control over a sprawling empire was to co-opt the local ruling classes. A wealthy landowner from Spain or a powerful chieftain from Gaul could be granted Roman citizenship as a reward for their loyalty and service. This was not a right bestowed upon the masses, but a strategic gift to secure the allegiance of key influencers on the frontiers. For these few fortunate men, everything changed. They gained legal protections, access to Roman courts, and the potential for their sons to pursue a political career in Rome itself. And crucially, they gained the suffragium, the right to vote. But here we encounter a glaring practical limitation. To exercise that vote, a provincial citizen had to physically be in Rome on the day of the election or legislative vote. For a wealthy aristocrat from southern Gaul, this meant a journey of weeks or even months, over the Alps and down the length of Italy. The cost, the time, and the danger of such travel were prohibitive for all but the most determined and affluent. In practice, this meant that a provincial citizen's right to vote was largely theoretical. He might proudly hold the status, but the opportunity to actually walk into the septa and cast his ballot was a rare and extraordinary event. The system was designed in a way that technically included the provincial elite, while ensuring the actual electorate remained dominated by Italians and those who lived in or near the city. While they were shut out of Roman politics, provincials were not living in a political vacuum. In fact, one of Rome's most effective tools of governance was exporting its own model of local administration. Throughout the empire, from Britain to North Africa, cities were organized as semi-autonomous municipia or coloniae. These towns often had their own local constitutions that were strikingly familiar echoes of the Roman system. They were run by councils of local decurions, the wealthy landowning class, and they elected their own local magistrate, often with titles like duumvir or aedile, using voting procedures that mirrored those in Rome. Archaeology gives us breathtaking evidence of this. The ruins of Pompeii, a Roman colonia, preserve campaign graffiti painted on walls, urging passing citizens to vote for specific local candidates. In other provincial cities, archaeologists have found bronze tokens and tessera that were likely used in local balloting. So, while a merchant in the province of Baetica in Spain could not vote for the Roman consul, he could very well participate in electing his own town's officials and debating local issues in his own forum. This exported version of democracy served a dual purpose for Rome. It gave local elites a satisfying taste of self-governance and a stake in the system, and it also offloaded the burdens of daily administration, maintaining roads, aqueducts, and public order onto the locals, making the empire much cheaper and easier to run. This leads us to a profound historical irony. Rome, a republic that brutally conquered its neighbors, became the primary vector for the spread of democratic ideas and institutions throughout the Western world. The very forms of civic life, the popular assemblies, the elected magistrates, the public debates, that we associate with self-rule were disseminated across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East by an imperial power that increasingly denied meaningful political participation to the vast majority of its own subjects. They taught the world how to hold an election while carefully reserving the most important ones for themselves. This centuries-old structure of exclusion was finally, and suddenly, overturned in 212 CE. The Emperor Caracalla, in a move that continues to baffle historians, issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, the Edict of Caracalla. With a single stroke of the pen, he granted Roman citizenship to almost every free-born man in the empire. On paper, this was the most democratic act in Roman history. Overnight, millions of provincials from Scotland to Syria were transformed from subjects into citizens, theoretically endowed with the full rights of a Roman, including the right to vote. But the irony is deep and a little tragic. By the early 3rd century, the Roman Republic had been dead for nearly 250 years. The assemblies of the people, once the roaring heart of the state, had long since fallen silent. Power was now firmly held by the emperor, his imperial bureaucracy, and the army. The elaborate rituals of the Comitia Centuriata and the Comitia Tributa were obsolete relics of a bygone era. Caracalla's grant of universal citizenship, therefore, was like giving a key to a house that had already been demolished. It conferred valuable legal and tax advantages, but the precious right to vote for which generations of allies and provincials had fought was, by that time, utterly meaningless. The door to the voting booth was open for everyone, just as the booth itself was being permanently closed. Yet, for all its grandeur and ritual, the entire edifice of Roman popular voting rested on a fragile foundation: the state's monopoly on force and the collective agreement to play by the rules. That foundation began to crack, then crumble, during the tumultuous final century of the Republic. The story of this decline is not one of a sudden collapse, but of a slow, bloody unraveling where ambitious men discovered that the legions they commanded were a far more powerful political tool than any number of votes they could win in the forum. The assemblies didn't just fade away. They were deliberately sidelined, intimidated into irrelevance, and ultimately made obsolete by the naked pursuit of power. The turning point can be traced to the rise of the military warlord, a new kind of politician whose authority flowed not from the people's vote, but from the loyalty of his soldiers. This shift began with Gaius Marius, a brilliant general from outside the traditional aristocracy who rewrote the rules of military service. To confront a devastating invasion, Marius opened the legions to the poorest citizens, the Capite Censi, men who had no property and therefore no stake in the state. These new soldiers swore their oath not to the abstract idea of the Roman Republic, but directly to their general, who promised them land, spoils, and a pension. A successful general now commanded a personal army, loyal to him above all else, and he could use that army to demand what he wanted from a state that had no soldiers of its own to oppose him. The legions became a political currency more valuable than any electoral victory. This dangerous new reality was hammered home with brutal force by Lucius Cornelius Sulla. After winning a major war in the East, Sulla returned to Italy to find his political enemies had seized power and stripped him of his command. His response was unprecedented. In 88 BCE, he did what no Roman general had ever dared. He ordered his loyal legions to march on their own city. The gates of Rome were breached not by a foreign enemy, but by its own citizens. Sulla's conquest was a watershed moment, proving that the will of the people, expressed through the assemblies, was meaningless in the face of determined military power. After seizing control, Sulla instituted a series of ruthless reforms, specifically designed to neuter the popular institutions that had opposed him. He gutted the power of the tribunes of the plebs, the traditional champions of the people, stripping them of their ability to propose legislation and veto acts of the Senate. He packed the Senate with his own supporters and fixed the cursus honorum, the path of political offices, to ensure that only men loyal to the conservative oligarchy could reach high command. His goal was to make the Senate the unchallenged center of power and prevent any future populist from rallying the people against the established order. He proved that the Republic's institutions could be reshaped at sword point to serve one man's vision. If Sulla provided the blueprint for using military force to override the Republic, his later rival, Julius Caesar, perfected it. Caesar's entire career was a masterclass in manipulating the vestiges of the voting system while simultaneously rendering it irrelevant. He would use his immense wealth, borrowed from creditors who bet on his future success, to fund spectacular public games and feasts, buying the fervent devotion of the urban populace. He cultivated a powerful populist image, positioning himself as the heir to the Gracchi brothers, the martyred tribunes who had fought for the common people. Through a complex web of political alliances, he ensured that his allies were elected to key magistracies, who would then pass laws benefiting him, most famously a multi-year military command in Gaul. For over a decade, Caesar governed from a distance, winning glorious victories and amassing a fortune and a battle-hardened army fanatically loyal to him alone. The assemblies in Rome continued to meet, but they were increasingly just rubber-stamping the deals cut by Caesar and his rivals. The final death knell for the assemblies was not a law, but a sound, the clashing of swords and the screams of the dying in the very heart of the forum itself. Political violence escalated from occasional scuffles to organized militarized terror. Gangs of armed thugs, often led by senators or tribunes, and sometimes composed of off-duty gladiators, became a common sight. They would clear the voting area of opponents, threaten voters, and even murder political rivals in broad daylight. The most notorious example was the events surrounding the tribune Publius Clodius Pulcher and his archenemy, Titus Annius Milo. Their street gangs turned sections of Rome into a war zone, culminating in 52 BCE, when Milo's retinue killed Clodius on the Appian Way. The subsequent funeral for Clodius devolved into an inferno. His supporters used the speaker's platform in the forum as a pyre for his body, accidentally burning down the ancient Senate house itself. This was more than just riot, it was symbolic. The very stage for Roman political speech was literally consumed by the fires of factional hatred. How could a citizen be expected to ponder his vote on a matter of law when the act of walking to the Sista might cost him his life? The chaotic and violent final years of the Republic created a powerful, widespread craving for order at any cost. The people were exhausted by decades of civil war, proscriptions, and street violence. The very liberty that the assemblies were meant to protect now seemed synonymous with chaos and instability. This deep yearning for peace is what allowed Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, to position himself not as a dictator, but as a restorer. After defeating all his rivals, he undertook a brilliant campaign of political theater. In 27 BCE, he appeared before the Senate and dramatically surrendered all his extraordinary powers, claiming his sole desire was to restore the traditional republic. It was a carefully staged performance. The grateful Senate, understanding the unspoken reality, immediately begged him to stay and granted him a new name, Augustus, the Revered One. More importantly, they granted him a new title, Princeps, or First Citizen. Under Augustus's new system, the Principate, The old republican forms were meticulously preserved, but all their power was systematically drained away. The assemblies still met, citizens still technically elected magistrates, but the outcomes were never in doubt. Augustus's immense wealth, his control of the legions, and his unchallengeable personal authority, known as auctoritas, meant that he alone decided who would stand for office and who would win. Voting became a hollow ceremony, a nostalgic ritual performed for the sake of appearance. The Roman people, once the sovereign rulers of the Mediterranean, were gradually transformed into passive spectators of their own government. The bustling, noisy, chaotic, and deeply flawed democracy of the Forum was finally silenced, replaced by the quiet, efficient, and absolute rule of one man. The vote had not been abolished, it had simply been made meaningless. Augustus understood the power of symbols and traditions better than any politician before him. Having emerged victorious from the ruins of decades of civil war, he faced a delicate task: how to consolidate absolute power in his own hands while paying lip service to the 500-year-old republican traditions that Romans still revered. His solution was a masterstroke of political theater. He didn't abolish the popular assemblies. He preserved them as magnificent, empty shells. Under his new system, the Principate, the bustling elections in the Campus Martius continued. Citizens still gathered, the raw getters still handed out tabelli, and the votes were still cast into the Sisti. But the vibrant, chaotic, and often corrupt engine of popular sovereignty had been completely disconnected from the wheels of power. The outcome was never in doubt. The people were no longer choosing their leaders. They were merely affirming choices that had already been made for them in the palace of the princeps. The mechanism for this quiet coup was both simple and devastatingly effective. Augustus gradually transferred the actual power to appoint magistrates to the Senate. However, this was no return to the old aristocratic republic. The Senate itself was now packed with his loyalists, purged of opposition, and utterly subservient to his will. When it came time for elections, Augustus would publish a list of his preferred candidates. This was not a suggestion, it was a command. To run for office without the emperor's blessing was not just futile, but potentially dangerous. The role of the assembly was thus reduced to a ceremonial ratification of the imperial slate. The citizen, once the theoretical sovereign of the state, was now relegated to the role of an extra in a political play. His vote, a performative act meant to create the illusion of continuity rather than to express any genuine choice. In his own meticulously crafted autobiography, the Res Gesti Divi Augusti, the deeds of the divine Augustus, laid out for all to see after his death, Augustus boasts of this very process with a stunning lack of irony. He writes, "In my 6th and 7th consulships, after I had extinguished the flames of civil war, and after by universal consent I was in complete control of affairs, I transferred the Republic from my power to the dominion of the Senate and people of Rome." This is a breathtaking claim, one that carefully obscures the reality of his perpetual, overarching authority. He speaks of transferring power back, yet he remained the princeps, the imperator, the holder of tribunician power for life. The phrase, "by universal consent I was in complete control of affairs," is the key. He acknowledges his absolute power while framing it as a temporary, necessary measure granted by a grateful people, a measure from which he never actually stepped down. He further reveals his cunning method in another section, stating, "After that time, I excelled all in influence, although I possessed no more official power than others who were my colleagues in each magistracy." Here, Augustus draws a critical distinction between raw power, potestas, which he shared with other magistrates, and overwhelming influence, auctoritas, which he claimed for himself alone. His auctoritas was the unspoken, unassailable gravity that pulled every political decision into his orbit. A senator or a magistrate might have the legal right to oppose him, but who would dare? His auctoritas was built upon his colossal wealth, which he used to fund public works and army pensions, making the entire state financially dependent on him. It was cemented by his command of the legions, whose loyalty was to him personally. and it was laundered through a propaganda machine that celebrated him as the bringer of peace, the restorer of tradition, and the son of a god. To vote against a candidate blessed by such a figure was not just politically pointless. It was socially unthinkable and could be perceived as an act of ingratitude towards the man who had ended the bloody civil wars. This created the central paradox of the Augustan age, the loud celebration of a restored republic existing simultaneously with the silent acceptance of a new monarchy. The temples were rebuilt, old festivals were revived with newfound splendor, and the language of liberty and republican virtue was constantly on everyone's lips. Yet, with every passing year, the institutions designed to protect that liberty were drained of their substance. The assemblies became a nostalgic ritual, a comforting reminder of a glorious past that was being meticulously curated even as it was being permanently entombed. Augustus didn't smash the voting urns. He simply ensured they were filled with predetermined outcomes, transforming the proud act of voting from an exercise of power into an expression of loyalty to the one man who now held it all. The Roman people, weary from decades of strife, largely accepted this bargain, trading their political voice for the security and stability he promised. They gained the Pax Romana, but they lost the Republic, and the once deafening roar of the sovereign people faded into a polite and orchestrated applause. With the foundation laid by Augustus, the gradual erosion of popular sovereignty accelerated under his successors, transforming the proud traditions of the Comitia into little more than a hollow pageant. The first emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty perfected the art of maintaining republican facades while systematically gutting their substance. Tiberius, who followed Augustus, made a show of deferring to the Senate and the assemblies, but his reign was marked by a deepening cynicism toward the electoral process. He initially attempted to involve the Senate in the selection of magistrates, but quickly grew frustrated with the petty squabbling and thinly veiled ambition he saw among the senators. In a move that revealed the new reality, he eventually removed the elections from the people altogether, transferring the last vestige of their power, the choice of magistrates, to the Senate. This was not an empowerment of the Senate, but a consolidation of his own control over a more manageable and compliant body. The people's role was reduced to offering acclamations, joyful shouts of approval for decisions that had already been made behind palace walls. The descent into farce became unmistakable under Caligula. His reign demonstrated how easily the empty rituals could be twisted by imperial whim into instruments of terror or absurdity. He treated the surviving political forms with open contempt. On one infamous occasion, he reportedly ordered the masses to gather and vote on a matter of supreme importance, creating a tense atmosphere of anticipation. When the citizens assembled, eager to exercise their long-dormant civic duty, the proposal he put before them was a mockery. They were to vote on whether his favorite horse, Incitatus, should be appointed to a consulship. This bizarre episode was more than just the madness of an individual. It was a symbolic act that laid bare the utter meaninglessness of the assemblies. The vote was no longer a mechanism of governance, but a toy for the emperor's amusement, a cruel joke played on a populace that once held the power to declare war and elect consuls. The assembly's function had been inverted from an expression of the people's will to a demonstration of their powerlessness. As the electoral and legislative functions of the assemblies withered, new mechanisms of lawmaking emerged to take their place, firmly centering power on the imperial throne. The chief source of law was no longer the lex, a law passed by the people, but the senatus consultum, a decree of the Senate. However, these senatorial decrees were increasingly just rubber stamp approvals of proposals that originated with the emperor, known as orations principes. The Senate, purged of opposition and steeped in a culture of sycophancy, rarely dared to contradict the imperial will. Even more powerful was the emperor's own right to issue edicts, decrees, and judgments that had the full force of law. This imperial authority, grounded in his imperium and tribunician power, allowed him to legislate unilaterally. The complex, noisy, and unpredictable process of winning over the citizenry was replaced by the quiet efficiency of a decree issued from the Palatine Hill. Law became less about public debate and consensus, and more about command and obedience. By the end of the 1st century CE, the transformation was complete. The historian Tacitus, writing with bitter nostalgia for the lost republic, noted that the election of magistrates had been transferred from the people to the Senate, and from the Senate to the emperor. The assemblies met only to hear the announcement of results, their enthusiastic cheers a mandated performance of loyalty rather than a genuine celebration of choice. The physical spaces that had once hosted these vibrant gatherings fell into disuse or were repurposed. The Civic Julia, the magnificent voting enclosure on the Campus Martius built by Julius Caesar, became a fashionable market and a venue for gladiatorial shows, its original purpose forgotten by new generations. The very tools of democracy were now relics. This evolution from reality to ritual represents one of history's most poignant examples of how liberty can be surrendered not always in a single violent overthrow, but through a slow, incremental process of theater and intimidation. The Romans did not wake up one day to find their republic gone. They watched it fade away, ceremony by ceremony, over decades. The preserved rituals provided a comforting illusion of continuity, allowing citizens to tell themselves that the old ways still mattered even as their substance evaporated. The empty vote became the perfect symbol for this new age. It maintained the outward form of participation while requiring the complete surrender of actual power. The story of the Roman assemblies under the empire is a powerful reminder that the health of a democracy is measured not by the preservation of its rituals, but by the genuine power of its people to choose their destiny. For centuries, the intricate rituals of Roman voting were known only through the words of historians like Cicero and Livy, a compelling but incomplete picture. The true magic, the tangible connection to that distant world, comes from the silent testimony of archaeology. While the wooden ballots and wax tablets themselves were highly perishable, the Romans, in their meticulousness, left behind a remarkable physical trail that allows us to reconstruct their democratic process with stunning clarity. The most evocative discoveries come from Pompeii, the city frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Here, preserved under layers of volcanic ash, we find the very tools of civic choice. Archaeologists have unearthed numerous writing stelae, the simple metal instruments that would have been used to scratch a choice into a wax ballot. More poignantly, they have found examples of wax tablets, though none can be definitively identified as a voting tabella. Their existence confirms the widespread use of the technology. The most direct evidence of electoral fervor, however, is painted on the walls themselves. Pompeii is covered in political graffiti, campaign advertisements urging citizens to vote for a specific candidate for a local office. I ask you to elect Gaius Julius Polybius as duumvir. He brings good bread, reads one famous endorsement. These public pleas, preserved for 2 millennia, instantly transport us to the noisy, competitive atmosphere of a Roman election season, proving that the hustle for votes is a truly ancient art. To understand the scale of a major Roman vote, we must look to the heart of Rome itself and the magnificent Civic Julia. This was not a simple open field but a monumental, purpose-built voting hall commissioned by Julius Caesar and completed by Emperor Augustus on the Campus Martius. Imagine a massive rectangular enclosure, surrounded by a colonnaded portico, capable of holding tens of thousands of citizens. It was designed to bring order and grandeur to the voting process. Within the Civic, voters would be channeled through specific pathways to prevent chaos, passing officials who distributed ballots and finally arriving at the voting urns. While only fragments of its foundations and a later reconstruction remain today, the sheer size of the Civic's footprint speaks volumes about the importance and colossal logistics of public voting in the late Republic and early Empire. The act of depositing the vote is made real by finds of the cista, the voting urn. These were not mere baskets but substantial containers, often depicted on coins and in reliefs as large, ceremonial vessels. A bronze coin minted by a moneyheir named P. Licinius Nerva in the 1st century BCE shows 2 citizens each dropping a folded tablet into a cista placed on a table, with the onlooker supervising the process, a tiny, illustrated manual of Roman voting. While a complete cista used in the Comitia has yet to be found, their representation on official state currency confirms they were a standardized and recognized symbol of the electoral process. Yet, for all these incredible finds, the historical record is filled with frustrating silence. The organic materials at the heart of the system, the wooden ballots, the wax-filled tablets, the woven wicker of the cisti have almost entirely vanished, decayed by time. This is why literary sources remain indispensable. They provide the narrative that the artifacts alone cannot. The writings of Cicero complaining about bribery, or the accounts of Plutarch describing the voting order, give life and context to the silent stele and stone ruins. It is the marriage of archaeology and text that allows us to confidently walk through the process. From a citizen taking a wooden tablet from a regator, to etching his choice with a metal stylus, folding the tablet to protect his secret, and finally dropping it into the guarded cista, adding his voice to the fate of the Republic. Each small find is a direct link to the hands that once held them, a physical echo of the moment a single Roman citizen exercised his most sacred right. But to truly understand the uniqueness of the Roman system, we need to step outside of Italy and compare it with its most famous contemporary, the democracy of ancient Athens. While both civilizations are foundational to Western concepts of self-rule, their approaches to citizen participation were radically different, built on opposing philosophies about who should govern and how. The Athenian model was the purest form of direct democracy the world has ever seen. In Athens, every major decision of state, from declaring war to funding a new naval ship, was made by the ecclesia, the principal assembly. This wasn't a representative body, it was a mass meeting of the citizenry. Any Athenian citizen, from the wealthiest landowner to the poorest potter, had not only the right to attend but also the right to speak, to propose legislation, and to vote directly on the outcome. The political power of the individual citizen was direct and unmediated. In Rome, by contrast, your political voice was always filtered through a group. You voted as part of your century or your tribe, and your individual mark on the wax tablet was amalgamated into a single, collective vote for your bloc. The Roman system was one of controlled, indirect participation, while the Athenian ideal was one of raw, unfiltered popular sovereignty. This philosophical divide is perfectly illustrated by their methods for selecting officials. The Athenians were deeply suspicious of elections, believing that they inherently favored the wealthy, the well-born, and the rhetorically gifted. Instead, they placed their faith in a remarkable practice known as sortition, the random selection of citizens by lot to fill the vast majority of public offices. From the Council of 500 that prepared the agenda for the assembly to the jurors in the people's courts. The logic was that this was the only way to ensure true equality and prevent the rise of a professional political class. Every citizen was considered capable of governing, and randomness was seen as the will of the gods. Rome's entire political culture was the absolute opposite. It was built on a fierce, hyper-competitive electoral struggle for prestige, power, and magistracies. The Roman path to power, the cursus honorum, was a series of fiercely contested elections where candidates spent vast sums, called in political favors, and deployed their networks of clients to win. For the Romans, leadership was earned through competition and proven merit, not assigned by the luck of the draw. The scale of the two societies also made their different systems necessary. Athens, even at its height, had a much smaller and more manageable citizen body, likely never exceeding 40 to 50,000 adult men at its peak. This made a direct assembly, while still a massive gathering of several thousand, a logistically feasible proposition. Rome, however, grew to encompass hundreds of thousands of citizens spread across Italy, and later the entire Mediterranean. The Roman system, with its complex grouping into centuries and tribes, was an ingenious, if deeply flawed, engineering solution to the problem of scale. It was a way to manage the unwieldy mass of a vast citizenry and make collective decision-making possible, even if it was deliberately skewed. The Athenian system simply couldn't have functioned for a population the size of Rome's. So, which system was more democratic? The answer depends entirely on how you define the word. If by democratic we mean the broadest and most direct participation of individual citizens in the immediate act of governance, then Athens wins without contest. The average Athenian citizen had a far more direct and frequent hand in making laws, conducting foreign policy, and administering justice than his Roman counterpart ever did. However, if we define democratic as a system that incorporates diverse social classes into the political structure over the long term, then Rome's republic arguably had a more lasting and integrated impact. The Athenian system was brilliant but brittle, and it collapsed within 2 centuries. The Roman Republic, for all its inequalities, had mechanisms like the plebeian council and the tribunes that allowed the common people to constantly negotiate for power and integrate themselves into the political fabric, creating a more resilient, though never egalitarian, system that lasted for nearly 500 years. Athens gave us the pure ideal of democracy. Rome gave us the complex, messy, and enduring machinery of a republic. The legacy of Roman voting is not a relic confined to history books. It is a living blueprint, a set of political DNA that was extracted, studied, and woven into the very foundations of modern Western democracy. When the founders of nations like the United States looked for a model of a large, stable republic, they looked past the direct democracy of Athens and fixed their gaze squarely on Rome. They saw in its complex system of checks and balances, its representative assemblies, and its layered government a template for a society that could avoid the tyranny of a monarch without succumbing to what they feared was the chaos of mob rule. This fascination was profoundly shaped by Enlightenment thinkers, particularly the French philosopher Montesquieu. In his seminal work, The Spirit of the Laws, he famously championed the Roman ideal of a mixed constitution, arguing that political stability was achieved by blending the elements of monarchy represented by the consuls, aristocracy, the Senate, and democracy, the assemblies. This concept of separated powers, each branch checking the ambition of the others, became the cornerstone of the American experiment. The echoes are unmistakable when you place the structures side by side. The U.S. Senate is a direct namesake and functional heir to the Roman Senate, conceived as a deliberative body of experienced statesmen designed to temper the passions of the more popular branch of government. Even more strikingly, the U.S. Electoral College feels like a philosophical descendant of the Comitia Centuriata. Both are systems where citizens do not directly elect the chief executive. Instead, they vote to select intermediaries electors in the modern system, centuries in the ancient one, who then cast the definitive votes. Both systems were explicitly designed, though in different ways, to add a layer of deliberation and to balance the influence of densely populated urban areas against more sparsely populated rural regions. The very idea of a bicameral legislature, a two-house system, is a Roman invention adopted to give different social orders a voice. Yet for all the structural borrowing, the philosophical goal of modern democracies represents a fundamental rejection of the Roman core principle. Rome's system was not designed for equality, but for managed inequality. Its weighted voting was a feature, not a bug. It was engineered to ensure that the wealthiest and most established classes could guide the state and prevent radical change. Modern constitutions, by contrast, enshrine the aspirational ideal of political equality, the principle that each citizen's vote should carry equal weight, even if the reality sometimes falls short. We have universally adopted the Roman innovation of the secret ballot, but we have repurposed it. For the Romans, it was a shield for the individual against intimidation. For us, it is the bedrock of a free and fair expression of the popular will, a right extended in theory to all adult citizens, not just a propertied male minority. This represents the ultimate evolution of the Roman tool into a truly democratic instrument. This long journey from the forum to the modern polling station forces a sobering and urgent question. Are we repeating Rome's mistakes even as we try to emulate its successes? The pathologies that plagued the late Republic feel uncomfortably familiar. The rampant electoral bribery, the ambitus conducted by divisors with their detailed knowledge of key voting blocks, finds its parallel in the modern influence of dark money, superPSEs, and sophisticated micro-targeting campaigns that can effectively purchase airwaves and voter attention. The Roman elite's use of patronage networks to command the votes of their clients mirrors the modern power of lobbyists and special interests to sway policy through campaign contributions and promises of future favor. The violent street clashes between the gangs of Clodius and Milo that made the Forum a battlefield have their echo in the political violence and intimidation that increasingly stains modern political discourse. Perhaps the most profound parallel is the gradual erosion of trust in the institutions themselves. The Roman people eventually grew weary of the corruption and chaos, and in their exhaustion, they traded their liberty for the stability offered by Augustus. They accepted the hollowing out of their assemblies in exchange for peace and order. This poses a critical challenge for modern democracies. When political systems are perceived as corrupt, rigged, or hopelessly biased toward powerful elites, citizens can become disillusioned. The danger is not necessarily a literal emperor arising, but a quiet acceptance of authoritarian strongmen who promise to cut through the gridlock and corruption, even if it means bypassing democratic norms. The Roman lesson is that a republic does not fall in a single day. It is relinquished piece by piece, often with popular acquiescence, as the rituals of democracy are maintained long after the power has been drained from them. The story of Roman voting is therefore more than an academic history. It is a cautionary tale and a mirror. It shows us the brilliance of what we built upon, and it holds up a reflection, challenging us to see if the cracks in our own system are the same ones that once widened until the whole edifice of a republic came tumbling down. Now that we've walked through the mechanics and the history, it's time to clear away some of the cobwebs of misconception that often surround this topic. Our modern view of ancient Rome is frequently filtered through a Hollywood lens or simplified by textbook summaries, leading to some persistent myths about how their system truly worked. The most common and fundamental misunderstanding is the belief that Rome was a democracy in the Athenian sense. It was not. Rome was a republic, and that is a crucial distinction. A democracy, like ancient Athens, practices direct rule by the people, where citizens vote on laws and policies themselves. A republic, however, is a system of indirect rule where citizens elect representatives to make those decisions on their behalf. The Roman Republic brilliantly incorporated democratic elements, the popular assemblies, into a mixed constitution that also included aristocratic elements in the Senate and quasi-monarchical elements in the consuls. This blend was designed to prevent any single group from monopolizing power, but it was never intended to place ultimate sovereignty directly in the hands of every citizen. Another pervasive myth is the idea that everyone who lived in Rome had a voice. The reality was starkly exclusive. The right to vote was a privilege reserved for adult, free-born male citizens. This immediately disqualified the entire female population, all enslaved individuals who made up a huge portion of the society, and any foreign residents living within Rome's vast territories. Even among male citizens, your influence was heavily weighted by your social class and wealth, as we saw with the voting order in the Centuriate Assembly. The system was engineered to ensure that the wealthy and well-connected had a disproportionately loud voice, while the votes of the common man were often diluted or rendered moot by the procedural rules. So, when we picture a Roman election, we must banish the image of a universal suffrage. It was a privilege extended to a minority of the population, and within that minority, power was carefully calibrated to favor the elite. We also often imagine these ancient elections as orderly, dignified affairs, perhaps with toga-clad statesmen casting votes with solemn grace. The truth was far messier and more familiar. Roman elections were frequently chaotic, blatantly corrupt, and sometimes even violent. The Campus Martius on election day was less like a modern polling station and more like a raucous festival combined with a high-stakes political convention. The air was thick with the din of last-minute campaigning, the shouts of candidates working the crowds, and the potential for brawls between rival factions. Bribery was not a rare exception. It was a common and expected part of the political process, so much so that specific laws had to be repeatedly passed to try and curb it, with little lasting success. The introduction of the secret ballot was itself a response to this rampant intimidation and corruption. The entire process was a turbulent, human, and deeply flawed endeavor, reflecting all the ambition and frailty of the people who participated in it. Finally, it's an oversimplification to blame the fall of the Roman Republic solely on a broken voting system. While the vulnerabilities in their electoral process, the corruption, the inequality, the mob violence certainly created instability and eroded public trust, they were symptoms of a much deeper sickness, not the cause of death itself. The Republic's collapse was the result of a catastrophic convergence of military, economic, and social factors. The rise of professional armies loyal to their generals instead of the state meant that political power could be backed by military force, as Sulla and Caesar demonstrated. Economic upheavals, from vast wealth flowing in from conquests to the displacement of small farmers, created a desperate urban poor who became reliant on populist leaders for handouts. The old social fabric of mutual obligation between patrons and clients strained and tore under the pressure of unprecedented wealth and ambition. The voting system didn't cause these problems. It was simply the arena where they played out. It was ultimately overwhelmed by forces it was never designed to control. The flawed republic didn't fall because its votes were corrupt. It fell because its legions, its economy, and its social order had been transformed beyond the ability of any political process to contain. This deep dive into ancient Rome might feel like a journey into a distant and irrelevant past, but the echoes from the Forum are far louder in our modern world than we might realize. The political challenges the Romans wrestled with, the tension between representation and control, the corrosive influence of wealth, and the very architecture of a fair vote, are not relics. They are living, pressing issues that dominate our headlines today. Understanding how they approach these problems offers us a 2,000-year-old mirror, reflecting both the timeless virtues of republican government and its most persistent vulnerabilities. Consider the structure of the Roman tribes. By corralling the massive urban population into just 4 voting blocks while granting 31 tribes to the more sparsely populated countryside, the Romans engineered a system that systematically undervalued the votes of city dwellers. This isn't just an ancient curiosity, it's a stark parallel to modern gerrymandering. Today, political maps are often meticulously drawn to concentrate opposition voters into a few overpowered districts, diluting their influence everywhere else. The tools have changed, from hereditary tribal enrollment to sophisticated computer algorithms, but the goal remains disturbingly similar: to shape the electorate to produce a predetermined result, ensuring that the act of voting confirms power rather than challenges it. And then there is the ever-present specter of money. The Roman divisors, those organized agents distributing cash to key voting blocks, would feel right at home in the world of modern super PSEs and dark money networks. The unending struggle to prevent vast wealth from translating directly into political power is a battle the Romans clearly lost. Their repeated, and ultimately failed, attempts to pass laws against electoral bribery, the leges de ambitu, read like an ancient precursor to our own Sisyphean efforts at campaign finance reform. The lesson here is sobering. When the rewards of political victory are immense, the temptation to invest extraordinary sums to secure that victory becomes almost irresistible. The Roman experience suggests that policing the line between legitimate campaigning and outright corruption is a perpetual struggle, one that requires constant vigilance and adaptation. This is precisely why the Roman invention of the secret ballot was such a revolutionary achievement. For us, it's a mundane, accepted feature of democracy. For them, it was a hard-won shield against intimidation and coercion. The Lex Gabinia and its sister laws were a direct response to a system where your vote could be witnessed by your employer, your landlord, or your patron. The secret tablet ensured that a citizen's choice could be truly his own, a private matter of conscience. In an era where some modern democracies are flirting with digital voting systems that could potentially erode that secrecy, the Roman struggle is a powerful reminder of why the private vote is a cornerstone of a free and fair election. It is the ultimate defense against the pressure to conform and the fear of reprisal. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Rome is about the delicate balance between democracy and stability. The Roman system was explicitly not designed to be perfectly democratic. Its weighted voting in the Centuriate assembly and its biased tribal structure were intended to give the wealthy, propertied class a controlling interest in the state. The founders of the Roman Republic feared the volatile mob of the urban poor as much as they feared a tyrant king. Their goal was a stable, sustainable state that incorporated the people's voice without being overrun by it. This creates a challenging philosophical question for us today. Is the purest form of democracy always the most desirable? Or are there merits to designing systems that promote deliberation, temper sudden passions, and protect against the tyranny of the majority? The Roman answer was a cautious yes, but their solution came with its own immense cost, entrenched elitism, and a built-in resistance to change that ultimately contributed to its downfall. The story of Roman voting doesn't offer us easy solutions, but it provides an invaluable context. It shows us that the problems we face are not new. They are the ancient challenges of organizing a society where power is supposed to reside with the people. Their history is a masterclass in both the ingenuity of political engineering and the unintended consequences that arise from every design choice. As we debate electoral college reforms, campaign spending, independent redistricting commissions, and the security of our ballots, we are continuing a conversation that began on the Campo Marzio over 2 millennia ago. We have the opportunity to learn from their triumphs and their catastrophic failures, to build systems that are not only democratic in form but resilient and just in practice. The Roman Republic ultimately collapsed because its political system could no longer contain the social and economic forces it had unleashed. Our task is to heed that warning, to ensure our own institutions remain flexible, fair, and truly capable of hearing the voice of every citizen. So as the dust settles on the Forum and the last citizen departs the Campus Martius, what are we to make of this complex, contradictory, and utterly fascinating system? The story of Roman voting is not a simple tale of the birth of democracy. It is a far richer, more human story of ambition, ingenuity, and the eternal struggle to balance order with liberty. We've seen a republic that was remarkably open for its time, granting millions a voice through the prized status of citizenship, yet one that was also ruthlessly exclusive, silencing women, the enslaved, and the poor through procedural engineering. It was a system that celebrated the sovereignty of the people in its grand rituals, while its weighted votes and patronage networks ensured that the aristocracy could almost always steer the ship of state. This was not an oversight, it was by design. The Roman Republic feared pure democracy as much as it feared tyranny, and its voting methods were a brilliant, if flawed, attempt to find a middle path. This grand experiment evolved from a noisy, vibrant, and genuinely consequential political process into a hollow ceremony under the watchful eye of an emperor. The assemblies that once declared war and elected consuls were gradually reduced to a polite audience, applauding decisions made elsewhere. The vote, that powerful symbol of citizenship, became a performance, a comforting ritual that maintained the illusion of the old ways while the reality of power consolidated into a single pair of hands. This transformation from a functional system to a ceremonial one is perhaps one of the most crucial lessons Rome offers us. It shows that the forms of democracy can be preserved long after its substance has faded, and that a people, weary of chaos, can sometimes willingly trade their voice for stability. Yet, for all its flaws and its ultimate failure, we must not overlook its staggering achievement. For nearly 500 years, the Roman Republic managed a sprawling and diverse territory through a system that, however imperfectly, incorporated the will of its citizens into the fabric of government. It was a groundbreaking experiment in large-scale representative government that would inspire philosophers and revolutionaries for centuries to come. The very ideas of a Senate, of veto power, of term limits, and of checks and balances are part of Rome's enduring legacy. Their struggles with gerrymandering, campaign finance, and the influence of wealth in politics are not ancient history. They are a mirror reflecting our own ongoing challenges. The enduring mysteries of Roman voting, the precise feel of the wax tablet, the thunderous roar of a tribe casting its vote, the tense silence as the first results were announced remind us that democracy was never a finished invention discovered by the Greeks or perfected by the Romans. It has always been, and will always be, a work in progress. It is a constant negotiation between ideals and realities, between inclusion and exclusion, between the power of the many and the ambition of the few. The Romans started a conversation about what self-government could look like for a large and complex society. And that conversation is one we are still having today. Their story doesn't give us all the answers, but it provides us with an invaluable 2,000-year head start on understanding the questions. I'd love to hear what part of this story resonated most with you. What surprised you the most about how the Romans voted? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed unraveling this historical mystery with me, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the